Sometimes the paywall you have to jump over in order to start collecting old Magic cards seems higher than Tommy Chong, and nowhere is that more evident than the price listings for some of Magic's earliest sets. For instance, if you want a piece of Beta Power 9 like Time Walk, well, that's going to set you back by twice the price of my first card. That's a lot of dollars. Even if you want something slightly less iconic but still cool like Balance, that'll cost you 4 figures if you want something near mint. If you want a Shivan Dragon from Beta, that's apparently unbuyable. And of course, we haven't even mentioned Black Lotus yet. You want one of those? It really just comes down to how many generations of your descendants you're willing to sacrifice ritualistically. So sometimes it can seem literally impossible for your average collector of cardboard oddities to actually pick up anything decent, much less playable, from a set like Beta. But today I'm going to set about attempting to dispel everything that I've just set up in the first minute or two of this intro. Gotcha, there are actually plenty of interesting, cool, fun, and even playable beta cards that most players can't afford a copy of. Whether you want to slip them into your commander decks, or you just want to start collecting old cards, or you just want to have some cool old Magic cards, today I'm going to give you at least 10 options for awesome cards you can have from beta for under 10 bucks. Let's get to it. What's up, my wizards? It's Dev, Mtg. We like to have magic, and today I'm pretty psyched if you can't tell. It's because I get to talk about old cards, which is something I like to do if you haven't noticed by the intros lately. But a couple of things I do need to lay out before we get into the list here. First of all, like and subscribe, do that. But second of all, and most importantly, I want to go ahead and get this out of the way. This is not in any way a hashtag MTG Finance video. I'm not giving you advice on what to invest in here, because I guess if you wanted to, you could pick up a couple of copies of some of these cards at like $5 and then sell them for $6.50 like 10 years down the road, but you shouldn't need me to tell you that's not the smartest investment. Actually, it's a pretty good rule of thumb that you probably shouldn't be taking financial advice from someone recording YouTube videos on their couch. Actually, matter of fact, scratch the on their couch part. You probably just shouldn't be taking financial advice from YouTube people. You go to Reddit. Kidding, don't do that either. Well, let's go ahead and get the list started with an honorable mention here, which is basically could have been on the list, honestly, but I just wanted 11 slots because I'm greedy. We're going to talk about Unsummon here for just a second. This is unlike some of the other cards on the list. This actually gets reprinted into Standard every now and again, and it's in Standard right now, as a matter of fact. And there's always going to be some number of players that really like to play old Magic cards in their brand new Standard decks. So for that reason, this ironically tends to hold a little bit of value, and you can get a copy of Unsummon right now for like $5 moderately played, which is not a bad deal. I mean, if you were trying to, say, bling out a mono blue tempo deck in Standard right now, you could buy a foil Brazen Borrower, just one. That'd probably cost a lot of money, but for very likely less than that, you can get a whole playset of beta Unsummons. And which do you think is cooler? I mean, to my mind, I'll take the playset of Unsummons every time. Now, let's get into the actual list here with number 10, a card that's been reprinted a bunch of times, as have a lot of the cards on the list. I mean, you're not going to get anything on the reserved list for under 10 bucks. I'm sorry about that, but you can get some very iconic old Magic cards that not only will hold and retain and even gain some value over time, but they just look really cool in a commander deck, like Drain Life, for instance. Not only is this an iconic card throughout Magic history, but it can still do plenty of work in the right commander deck. You know, you got a bunch of Grim Monoliths and Basalt Monoliths and other things like Soul Ring that give you a bunch of mana. All you have to do is filter that into Initiates of the Ebon Hand and cast a huge Drain Life for all of said mana. Especially decks that can generate infinite mana, of which there are infinite iterations in Commander. All you gotta do is, again, just filter it through Initiates, and then bam, huge Drain Life to effectively end a player's game and give you all the life in the world. And number 9 is a card that's not quite as iconic as Drain Life, which is saying something, because Drain Life, while iconic, is like low tier iconic. But number 9 is Soul Net. I put this at 9 because any deck can play this card, but especially decks like Aristocrats can pump extra mana into this whenever a creature dies and end up gaining a bunch of life. But you don't even have to be playing Aristocrats. Plenty of creatures are going to be going to the graveyard pretty much every turn cycle in a game of EDH. Creatures just can't stay out in that format, and Soul Net can gain you a bunch of life, especially if you're the player with the sweeper and a bunch of extra mana. Well, then you're right back in the game if you're at a low life total. Soul Net's pretty cool. Doesn't go in every deck, but any deck can play it, and that's why artifacts have kind of an advantage on a list like this. All that said, the card may not look too powerful at first glance, but there are plenty of life gain decks that have multiple triggers every time you gain any amount of life, so obviously this allows you to do it at instant speed, on your opponent's turn sometimes. There's just a lot of cool stuff you can do with Soul Net to trigger your Johnny's Pride Mates and your Heliod's and all kinds of other stuff. But speaking of cheap artifacts that gain life and require mana to activate, that's a fairly narrow category, but a group of cards I like a little bit more than Soul Net for all intents and purposes is the Throne of Bone, Ivory Cup cycle, etc., etc. These are actually pretty decent, depending on which color you play, obviously. Some of the cheaper ones, like Ivory Cup, will only cost you like $4 to order, but they're not quite as good because not as many people play white in EDH. And obviously, you want these to trigger not off of just your spells, but your opponent's spells. For that reason, Throne of Bone, the black one, and the blue one tend to cost a little bit more because there's a lot more black and blue spells being flung around on most EDH tables. The green one kind of costs middling. I think it's like $7 right now. And Throne of Bone at the top is going to cost you like $10. But all of them can be gotten for less than $10 moderately played. And they're all not bad either, whether you're playing with artifact synergies. Sometimes you want something like this laying around. Life gain synergies. That's why Ivory Cup is actually not a bad deal, even if your opponent's not playing too much white. Again, as long as you're playing Pride Mates and Heliod's and whatnot, Ivory Cup can be a really, really good card to play early on in the game. So all of these are actually decently playable depending on the commander deck they go in, and they can all be gotten for really cheap. But speaking of a cycle of cards that care about colors, you see how each entry dovetails into the next? That's how you make a list here on YouTube, son. But anyway, number 7 is Circles of Protection, also known as cops. Now, I've heard a lot of people online lately say that all cops are bad, but I gotta make an exception here. I'm so sorry. Seriously, I couldn't resist. How do you not make that joke? Anyway, Circle Protection White is the cheapest one right now. You can get it moderately played for about $2.50, which is a pretty good deal for like any card from beta. But for some of the better ones, like Circle of Protection Red, Circle of Protection Black, it's going to cost you a little bit more. Those will creep towards the $10 range, but obviously they're, in most cases, far more useful. But that said, all of the Circles of Protection are pretty useful, no matter which color you happen to be hosing at any given time. Enchantress decks love these for one. They're really cheap to get down in the first place, and they don't cost that much to actually activate. Just 1 mana per activation to keep your opponent's biggest hitters from actually dealing damage to you every combat step is really not that much to ask. But, especially in black and red, there are a whole lot of cards that deal damage to their controller, and Circles of Protection are awesome alongside those cards as well. But let's move on to number 6 here, which is Resurrection. This has not been reprinted as often as some of the other cards on the list, because lately it seems like it's easy to forget that White had the ability to reanimate creatures a lot more easily at one point in its history. We see callbacks to it, and things like Elspeth Conquers Death is probably the best example in Standard right now. And even cards like Unburial Rites from years back will call back to the fact that White has the ability to reanimate stuff sometimes, but you really don't see it that often, and obviously nowhere near as often as you see it on black cards. But White had much more of an ability back in the day to actually do this, and 4 mana for, it's effectively the same rate as Zombify, is actually not a bad deal. Now, number 5, right in the middle of the list here, is Invisibility, which for one has awesome art, which actually does matter a little bit when it comes to older cards and holding value and all that, but you wouldn't know it to look at the price of Invisibility. You can get a moderately played Invisibility right now for like $3 or $3.50, and that's actually a pretty good deal. I know that auras aren't always the most popular card type, but at the same time, it's an enchant creature. Your creature's more or less unblockable for the rest of the game, and with the amount of enormous creatures that crawl around a commander table at any given time, you would assume this would be a slightly more popular aura. There are so many decks that are more or less built around giant creatures or making your creatures as big as possible, that a creature with invisibility on it can easily end player's game and become the biggest target on the table at any given time. Just threaten to immediately take over the game if, again, the creature is big enough and has hexproof or something, right? So I just think that Invisibility definitely deserves a second look. You see what I did there? A sort of, kind of a pun. But anyway, let's move on to the next card. Invisibility's good. Now, number 4 is a card that I kind of really wish they'd reprint into Standard, but they almost certainly never will. And that's Wild Growth. This has been printed a whole bunch of times, especially throughout Magic's early years, but nothing looks as cool as an old beta black bordered Wild Growth with that gorgeous art. Look at that color palette. It's so good, but so is the card itself. The text box on this basically makes it a Llanowar Elves that can't be raft away or something, and there's an awful lot of value to that. Turn 1 ramp is something you see an awful lot of in EDH, but of course you can only play one Llanowar Elves, sort of, because you can also play like Fyndhorn Elves and some other 1-mana rampy elves to try to get to effectively 4 Llanowar Elves. But even then, you got 100 cards in your deck, so a playset isn't the same as it is in 60 cards. So a lot of decks need a whole bunch of 1-mana rampers if they're actually going to ramp on turn 1. And Sol Ring can't be the only thing that does that. So adding Wild Growth to that suite of cards can sometimes really make your ramp in the early game far more consistent. And honestly, being able to put this on any land and also produce blue or green mana, put it on an island. Produces blue and green, cast Growth Spiral, whatever, right? That can just be a huge deal some of the time. If you need double green, but you haven't gotten your second forest yet or whatever, there's just a lot of cool stuff that Wild Growth does, and it deserves to be on the list because even though it's kind of pricey at about $9.75 for a moderately played copy, it still goes really well in a lot of EDH decks, and again, it's just a gorgeous piece of cardboard. Now at number 3, we're in the top 3 now, and if you wanted some real power for your EDH deck, try picking up a copy of Pestilence. It's a little off-putting looking, honestly, but at the same time looks really cool. I've loved the art for Pestilence since I was like 11 years old, and they kept this art for a really long time until like the Urza Saga one came around. I really wish they'd reprint Pestilence back into Standard, but it's very likely not gonna happen for a while. I'm not even sure how good Pestilence would be in Standard. It'd be good, right? But we know for a fact that it's good in EDH, especially alongside creatures that are either indestructible or have protection from black. You can make entire EDH decks out of getting Pestilence into play and then abusing what it actually does. And I kind of recommend it. Pestilence is a pretty fun card in EDH for not only wiping the board, but also dealing damage to your opponents. So it's just a really sweet card. Goes well with things like Runed Halo, for instance, and all kinds of other stuff like the Wanderer that, prevents damage from being done to you. So it's just a cool card that has a whole bunch of different combos, wraps the board, deals damage to your opponent, has all kinds of different uses. And I'm surprised I don't see it on the EDH table more often. But if you're going to grab a copy of it, it's actually relatively cheap to grab a beta one and be the coolest player at the table, honestly. Side note, having a copy of Beta Pestilence does not necessarily make you the coolest player at the table. It's all about being a good person. But anyway, number 2. Let's go ahead and move on to that. Because number 2 is kind of a meme-y answer that was almost the honorable mention, but then I realized, this is actually one of the most investable cards in the set. But again, this is not a finance video. But, let me just throw this out here. Number 2 is Plains. Looks kind of weird. You can actually get multiple basic lands from Beta for under $10 right now. If you don't mind a moderately played, Mountain, you can get them for about $9 right now. If you want a moderately played Swamp, you can get those for about $8.50 or $9 as well. And those are awesome, but Plains are only about $5 no matter which art you pick up, which is a really sweet deal for a beta basic lands. Basic lands have been known to actually hold, retain, and gain value much more consistently than a lot of other cards from this set, especially the cards in the lower rarities. Honestly, basic lands have continued to climb in price over the last 15, 20 years from these early editions because everybody likes to play old basic lands. I'm no exception, and you're probably not either. And honestly, $5 for a beta Plains is a good enough deal that I think this almost deserves to be number 1. If you just comb through beta looking for, inexpensive steals, good deals from beta, you'd be hard pressed to do better than a $5 Plains because basic lands are actually I won't say pretty decent investments. I don't want to say that, but they are definitely cards that are more likely to hold their value than pretty much anything else on this list. That said, they didn't end up as #1 because, again, I didn't want #1 to be a meme. I didn't want it to feel memey in any way. But I also wanted #1 to be a fairly powerful and surprisingly cheap card. And I think Steel Artifact meets all of that criteria because there's going to be no lack of options for you to snag with this in most EDH games. And there's not a whole lot of other options in terms of finding, black bordered steel artifacts. There's a whole bunch of white bordered steel artifacts, but I guess you can get an unlimited edition steel artifact, and that still looks pretty cool. I like the art print on the unlimited edition, how the saturation is done. But while we're talking about how cool a card looks, I should probably bring up that Beta Steel Artifact just looks freaking amazing. So there's that, right? You could get this and pretty much any other card in this list from a different edition, but that's not the point. The point is having cool old cards that actually do awesome stuff on an EDH table, and this, again, I think meets all of those criteria and exceeds them. So there you go. There's 10 cards from Beta that you can get for, in a lot of cases, well under $10 right now. And it's not necessarily, again, about, getting a bunch of cards that are going to gain value over 5 years and suddenly you're a rich person. It's not. That's not going to happen. This is more for people who, either are nostalgic for old cards and want to just have some old cards in their hand for a relatively low price. I'm one of those people. I know there have to be more people like me out there, so I hope if you're there watching this video, you enjoyed it. Aside from that, there's also people who have just gotten into Arena who kind of want to dip their toe into collecting or at least have some piece of Magic history they can actually hold in their hands, and this video is for you too. Again, these cards aren't going to explode in value anytime soon from what I understand, but they're at least cool older cards that if you wanted to get into paper Magic and play EDH, you could do that while at the same time, again, having real actual pieces of Magic history that there aren't actually that many copies of in the world. So just try it out. Again, this is in no way is this financial advice. It's mostly for people who are either just getting into the game or are nostalgic for the older days of the game, and one way or the other, they want to have cool old Magic cards for relatively cheap, and I've tried to give you that outlet here. But let me know if I missed anything. There are plenty of other cards that I wanted to put on this list. Glasses of Urza was super close. You can get a moderately played Glasses of Urza for like $11.50 right now, I think. Near mint, it's closer to $20, which still isn't a terrible price. But Glasses of Urza, just 1 mana, you just get to see everyone's hand. Like that's actually not the worst thing in the world in terms of EDH decks. If you're building like a all artifact EDH deck, you could do worse. You could do worse in the one-drop department than Glasses. But there were a few cards I wanted on the list. Didn't end up on. Power Sync is another one. But anyway, I don't want to take up all of the things you're going to say down there. Just let me know what I missed down there. What are some cool old cards less than $10 in Beta that are either in your collection or you've got your eye on. But aside from that, do all the YouTube stuff. Like, subscribe. If you want to pick up any of these pieces, like I've advocated for in the video, if you want to do the thing I've said, I've made the whole video for, then click on the first link in the description. That'll take you over to TCG Player. I've made sort of a free-form, quote-unquote, deck list with all these cards in it. If you want to pick up any of them individually or the whole list, it won't be too expensive, and it'll help you dude out. And you'll have some cool old Magic cards for your EDH decks. But do that, and aside from that, I guess you can head on over to the Patreon if you want to check and pick out what content we do here on the channel. It's only $1 a month to vote in the polls that we do. As a matter of fact, the way the polls are going right now, it looks like I might get to talk about old cards again in the next video. But we'll see. We'll see if we get to talk about Fallen Empires or not. I really want to. But anyway, that's all I got for this one. So I guess I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.